Okay. This is Richie Venton, the Scottish Socialist Party Trades Union Organiser. We've just had an election where the population of Britain took their revenge on 14 years of Tory misrule and cruelty. The Tories have been booted out with record levels of rejection. It has to be said, to keep it in context, that the Tories are the oldest capitalist party in the world. So much so that during the 1950s, they had about 3 million members in Britain. They've been skilled at overcoming divisions within their ranks, at ruling the roost over the working class, whilst they represent the ultra-rich, and getting away with it for a good part of the past couple of centuries. But this is actually the worst result for the Tories since 1832, when the franchise was extended to the middle class, not the working class or women, but nevertheless an extension of the franchise. It's the worst result since then. And that in itself sums up the way in which the Tories have been rejected all over Britain, including the most unlikely places. We've seen strongholds of Toryism booting them out. But why is that? And does it represent some mass enthusiasm for the incumbent government now of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party? I would say absolutely not. The Labour Party didn't win this election, the Tories lost it. The Labour Party were seen as the main vehicle to boot the Tories out. We've got to get the Tories out was the main refrain of people on the streets and the workplaces in the communities. And they usually chose whatever weapon was available, however soiled and filthy they might have thought that it was. In some parts of Britain, that was the Liberal Democrats. They have only marginally increased their vote share by less than 1%, and yet they've increased the number of MPs radically to have 71 now in Westminster. They were seen as a vehicle to boot out the Tories in many seats. But across most of Britain, including in Scotland also, it was the Labour Party that were the benefactors of the rejection of the Tories. But it has to be qualified. And this qualification is vitally important when we look at the prospects under this Labour government. Because number one, it was the second lowest turnout by voters since 1885. The only year that was even lower marginally was 2001, and that was under Tony Blair's Labour government, when the turnout was marginally lower than even this time. In Scotland, that was also the case. 59% of the electorate voted. In other words, 41% couldn't bring themselves to vote for anybody because they rejected the whole lot with real anger. In fact, what I encountered on the streets was what could be called active disengagement from this election, a feeling of they're all the same, we're disgusted with the lot. And that's reflected also in Labour's vote, because whilst they've got a sweeping majority, an almost unprecedented one, only just short of the majority that Blair got in 1997, it's in very different circumstances. First of all, their share of 33% or so is substantially less than the 40% that Labour got under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership in 2017. And it's only just above the share of votes that Corbyn's Labour Party got in 2019, despite all the confusion that surrounded that particular election campaign, where people like Starmer insisted on changing Labour policy on Brexit halfway through the election and caused utter confusion amongst potential Labour voters. Or to put in more simple facts and figures, the Labour vote this time round was about 9.7 million across Britain. That's 3 million short of the 12.8 million that Corbyn's Labour Party got in 2017, or the 10.2 million that they got in what was seen as a terrible election in December of 2019. So we see a picture where the Labour Party has won votes from a cross-class coalition of former Tory voters as well as traditional Labour voters. But we've seen also in the case of Scotland the way in which, according to the patrician John Curtis, the professor, then something like 22% of pro-independence voters switched to Labour on this occasion purely to get the Tories out, as they saw it. And that is a coalition which will be ripped apart. It's totally contradictory, because what, of course, Starmer has been doing throughout this election is lowering the expectations of the working class by promising absolutely nothing. He uses the word change and then proceeds to contradict the word change in terms of the policies that he announces. Because Labour have said, as we tried to warn in previous podcasts, they've said they will stick to Tory spend limits, they will stick to Tory fiscal rules in terms of the ratio between national debt and GDP, etc. And as the Institute for Fiscal Studies put it during the election, there was a conspiracy of silence in both the Tory and Labour manifestos about the cuts to public services that would ensue from that stance. And when we hear Starmer talking about things like GB Energy, then it's a con trick. GB Energy, first of all, is going to be funded to the tune of just over £8 billion. Now, compared to the economy, that is peanuts at most. It's minuscule because, for example, it's reckoned that the total government spending on an annual basis is at least £1,200 billion in Britain. So £8 billion is nothing. It's invisible. And yet that's what they're going to put into GB Energy, which is a much trumpeted new green move on the part of Labour. But what does it actually consist of? Now, there's contradictory explanations coming from Labour spokespeople, but the fundamental narrative is that it will not produce 1 single kilowatt of energy. It won't produce any energy. It'll be an investment vehicle for private capitalist companies in the energy sector. In other words, it's yet another example of the Labour Party carrying out what they used to call PFI, Private Finance Initiative, in order to fatten the profit margins of the capitalist rich and big business by giving state subsidies and incentives in some form or another towards that. That's what that amounts to. And it's a con trick, in other words. And then I think much more dangerous is a development since the election, which is the fact that as part of Starmer's government, not only has he drafted in business people, for example, James Timpson, which I assume must mean that they're going to say to prisoners that, cobblers to the prisoners were throwing the key away, given that Timpson has a company covering both aspects of that. And on the other hand, we've got people like Al Milburn, who was the health secretary for Tony Blair. He's now been drafted in to be in charge of measures in the health service by Starmer's government. What does that signify? I think it signifies the implementation of what we warned throughout the election campaign, which is that Labour is the party of health service privatisation. They've declared on the first day after the vote the health service is in crisis. Wes Streeting, Health Secretary or Minister, said that. And what does he intend to do to cure that crisis? He does not intend to tax the rich. They've made plain they're not going to tax big business. They've declared already that corporation tax, which is historically low, less than half the 52% corporation tax rate under the early days of Maggie Thatcher, then they're not going to increase corporation tax on corporate profits. They're not going to increase the taxation on the rich, which currently the top rate is 40%, whereas in the early days of Maggie Thatcher, it was actually 83%. So they're not going to do any of those measures to redistribute wealth, to invest in the National Health Service or social care or other vital services that are falling apart at the seams. No, on the contrary, what they're going to do is usher in a profitable enterprise for the likes of American big business in the health service. That is the very present danger in this Labour government, which after all declared that the fingerprints of the bankers was all over the manifesto. That's what Rachel Reeves boasted when she was launching Labour's manifesto. So I think what we see is a Labour government which was only elected by 20% of the electorate, a Labour government where an exit poll by YouGov probably tells it all, where of those who were voting Labour, 50% said that they did so to get the Tories out, 5% said they did so because of Labour's policies, and 1% said so because of the leadership of Keir Starmer. So in other words, that confirms the point. This was an election where it was the Tories were defeated, not that Labour won in that sense. However, Labour does have a landslide, and that was assisted by the big increase in their vote in Scotland as well. Why did the SNP get wiped out the way they did? Well, first of all, I would make the point, whilst I'm no advocate of the SNP, that it's an illustration of the completely rigged nature of the Westminster voting system, because we saw the fact that the Labour Party in Scotland, with 35% share of the vote, got 37 MPs. The SNP, with 30% share of the vote, got 9 MPs. That's a reminder of the fact that even though the Labour Party conference of the past, I think it was 2 years ago, declared in favour of proportional representation, Starmer is absolutely adamant there'll be no such move because he's enjoyed the benefits of a rigged voting system in order to win this majority. And also, it's a rigged election system in the sense that you have to be one of the money bag parties in order to conduct a campaign to any effect, because it's the media, it's access to social media funding and so on that is get your messages across. It's no accident that the likes of not just The Economist and The Times and the Financial Times, but also The Sun came out in favour of Labour during this election. Why? Because they saw Labour as a safer capitalist government than the crisis-stricken Tory government. And that helped to bring about the election of Labour. But the SNP, their vote collapsed. Their vote collapsed to the tune of roughly 500,000 in Scotland. And why is that the case? Now, of course, there's explanations including things like branch form, the prolonged financial scandals and rumours and such like that surrounds all of that, the internal warfare around the leadership contest, etc. But I think the most fundamental explanation is the fact that the SNP is in essence a party of big business which has been very skillful at trying to appear to be friends to all classes at once, facing in two directions at the same time, claiming to be the workers' friend whilst being the friend of big business. But that's come unstuck, particularly in the period of 2022-23, when there was the strike wave, where workers had had enough, and quite often they were directly in confrontation with the Scottish Government, which at that time, of course, was also the Green Party. But even if it wasn't directly, then the rise of the class struggle at that time began to reveal the contradictions inside the SNP and the fact that it was carrying out austerity instead of defying Tory austerity, standing up on its hind legs and mobilising the population to defeat Tory cuts to public sector spending, workers' living standards and so on. In fact, workers have suffered a loss of wages very close to £11,000 on average compared to the period just before the financial crash of 2008. If wages had kept up with the way they were rising at that point, there'd be £10,700 better off than workers are on average today. So what we face now is a Labour government which won as a result of the disgust with the Tories, but also disgust increasingly with an SNP government which has been unimaginative, which has been just a kind of managerial capitalist institution, which tries to demonstrate that the best way to prove the benefit of independence is to just manage the capitalist system within devolution, when in fact the best way would be to say, we're going to build resistance. We're going to build resistance to public sector cuts. We're going to build resistance to the cuts to fund for local government. We're going to build resistance to wage cuts and health service privatisation. Instead of that, the SNP have complied with that and have paid the price. They've been punished for their compliance with Tory austerity in that respect. So I would say, in drawn towards a conclusion, that the Labour government will face upheaval. They're not going to have a honeymoon. I think there'll be a rapid move towards divorce proceedings on the part of the working class rather than a honeymoon for Starmer's Labour government, because they're not going to scrap the anti-trade union laws. Maybe they'll remove the minimum service level legislation, which has been useless anyway, because the once has been tried. The ASLEF Drivers Union on the trains just said, well, if you're going to impose that, we'll escalate the number of strike days, and the bosses backed off. That's the way to deal with it. So it's quite possible they'll throw a few crumbs like that. They're not going to implement measures like a £15 minimum wage to help combat the dire poverty of the working class. They're not going to spend on public services to restore the fabric of society. Instead, they're going to privatise, and there needs to be a massive resistance to measures like privatisation of our health service, because even though the health service is a devolved issue, you don't have to be a professor of the Barnett formula to point out that if there's a cut to actual government spending on the health service in England, then the consequentials of that through the Barnett formula is that there'll be less money for the health service in Scotland. And what will the Scottish Government do? Tragically, I think they'll tend to go down the same route of privatisation by another name. And we have to resist that. We need to organise against that, and also recognise that in the future, discuss with Labour will either be answered by a building of the left, of socialist opposition, or the danger is that the vacuum created by that disgust could be filled by right-wing populism in the form of Farage and his Reform UK party, which got 7% of the vote in Scotland. And although that's half the percentage rate of Britain as a whole, nevertheless is still a warning that unless socialism is put forward front and centre as an alternative to Labour's capitalist rule, then the danger is that people in disgust and despair would turn to the likes of the so-called easy answers, the racist answers and so on, of Farage and company, who now has a greater publicity platform. So the Scottish Socialist Party will be combining with others, and in particular combining with the organised working class and the trade union movement, to resist attacks from the Labour government, to make demands upon them. You've said you're for change, let's see it. Let's see change on wages. Let's see a £15 minimum wage. Let's see abolition of all zero contracts, not your weasel words about just scrapping a few of them. And we will also organise to resist things like health service privatisation. And in the future, it'll build support for independence in Scotland to get rid of rule by a Westminster government that does not look after the Scottish people. The Scottish Socialist Party will combine with the organised working class and others on the left to resist the cuts by the Labour government, the capitalist Labour government, to resist privatisation of sectors like the health service and other public services. And I think that the days where socialism and Scottish independence will rise are ahead of us. So I'm not despairing. I'm optimistic that the desire for change can be translated into real change, socialist change, in the years ahead.